Em nome da Boitempo, queria agradecer a todo o público presente, a todos que nos assistem pela internet nessa noite de sexta-feira. Hoje chega ao fim a etapa uspiana do terceiro Seminário Internacional Margem Esquerda, intitulado István Mészáros e os Desafios do Tempo Histórico, organizado com o apoio decisivo do Senedic USP. István Mészáros distingue-se atualmente como um dos mais importantes intelectuais marxistas. Autor de vasta obra, sua fecunda produção teórica se destaca pela radicalidade e pelo compromisso inabalável com a emancipação humana. Crítico dos apologetas do capital, Mészáros manteve-se coerente ao longo de seus 79 anos em não ceder aos encantos da conformidade. Ao contrário, sua trajetória está marcada pelo comprometimento com a construção de uma alternativa hegemônica e viável ao sistema sociometabólico do capital, cujos limites estruturais ele já apontava desde os anos 70. Mészáros graduou-se em filosofia na Universidade de Budapeste, onde foi assistente de Georg Lukács no Instituto de Estética. Deixou o leste europeu após o levante de outubro de 1956 e exilou-se na Itália. Desde 1991 é professor emérito na Universidade de Sussex, na Inglaterra. Foi também professor de filosofia e ciências sociais na Universidade de na Universidade de York, no Canadá. E também ministrou aulas na Universidade de St. Andrews, na Escócia, e na Universidade Autônoma do México. Em 2006, Mészáros recebeu o prêmio Isaac Deutscher pela obra A Teoria da Alienação em Marx. Em 2009, o prêmio Libertador al Pensamento Crítico, concedido pelo Ministério da Cultura da Venezuela por O Desafio e o Fardo do Tempo Histórico, cuja primeira edição mundial foi lançada em português pela Boitempo. O valor desse prêmio será doado à Universidade Bolivariana da Venezuela, uma generosa conduta que Mészáros também adota com os direitos autorais de todos os seus livros publicados no Brasil, repassados integralmente ao Movimento dos Trabalhadores Rurais Sem Terra, o MST, e, em caso recente, a associações de apoio às vítimas do furacão em Cuba. Dentre seus títulos, além dos dois já citados, a Boitempo já publicou Para Além do Capital, em 2002, O Século XXI, Socialismo ou Barbárie, em 2003, O Poder da Ideologia, em 2004, A Educação para Além do Capital, em 2005, Filosofia, Ideologia e Ciência Social, em 2008, e A Crise Estrutural do Capitalismo, em 2009. Do Capital. Hoje é com grande satisfação que lançamos sua mais recente obra, Estrutura Social e Formas de Consciência, a determinação social do método, que está à venda lá fora. Aliás, também aviso que ao final da palestra o professor se dispôs a assinar alguns autógrafos, se interessarem. Esse seminário organizado sobre a obra de Mészáros insere-se como mais uma modesta contribuição da Boitempo e da margem esquerda à difusão do pensamento crítico marxista. O primeiro seminário, ministrado em 2004 nesse mesmo auditório, teve como tema Reflexões sobre o Colapso. O segundo seminário, que marcou os 10 anos da fundação da Boitempo, em 2005, teve o título de As Aventuras de Karl Marx contra o Barão de Munchausen, a obra indisciplinada de Michel Lovy, e contou com a realização de debates em 4 universidades paulistas. Dessa vez, nesse terceiro seminário sobre Mészáros, motivaremos reflexões sobre sua obra em 9 universidades de 5 estados. Nada disso seria possível sem o apoio da CAPES, da FAPESP, Clássico, o PPFH, LPP, da UERJ, a ESS, a Federação dos Metalúrgicos do Rio Grande do Sul, CCJE, o FRJ, Revista Versus, FSA, Unesp, Unicamp, UNB, Cefet Minas Gerais, a reitoria da UFRGS, a pós-graduação da Sociologia USP. Agradecemos especialmente a comissão organizadora, composta por Emir Sader, Ivana Jenkins, Maria Orlanda Pinassi, Rui Braga, Ricardo Antunes e muito especialmente o Rodrigo Nobile, que se descabelou muito. A lista é vasta, incluiria também outros nomes de professores e colaboradores que nos apoiaram nesse esforço. Nossos sinceros agradecimentos a Rui Marques, Débora Prado e João Paulo, em São Paulo, e outras cidades, assim como agradecemos a todos que participaram dessa construção em homenagem a István Mészáros. Um pensador marxista que não apenas nos motiva, com seu exemplo concreto e cotidiano, a trabalhar pela construção de um sistema alternativo de reprodução social, como também tem a ousadia de, nesses tempos sombrios, fornecer elementos teóricos comprometidos com uma reflexão crítica e transformadora do mundo atual em um mundo verdadeiramente socialista. Bom, antes de ouvir o professor Mészáros, teremos a apresentação de um solo, a suíte número 1 de Bach, por Suzy Mészáros. Por isso, peço da plateia silêncio, peço também que desliguem celulares, peço também... Senhoras e senhores, eu passo a palavra ao professor István Mészáros.
Well, let me say thank you, first of all, for this great honor of being with you all. Express my thanks to Boitempo Editorial, Vanna Jenkins and Marjan Meskerda for organizing this event, and my colleagues who generously contributed throughout these days. And of course, very much express my thanks to you all who have come to these meetings. We share so much, you don't even know how much, including our love of football. And in fact, better than that, our love for Brazilian football. Because what has not been mentioned, that I happen to have a beautiful Brazilian granddaughter who happens to be here right now in São Paulo. And at the last time when we had the World Championship in England, where they lived with their friends, after the Brazilian victory, winning the championships, they went around in town to the big public park singing Brazilian songs. And people in the streets applauded them. They joined in their joy because it is possible. They never saw each other, but humanity tied them together. And joining in that way was an expression of that. Now, of course, I want to say, I very much hope that next year we shall win again the World Championship. Because it stays in the family. Now, I have chosen for today a subject for which, of course, we all have to work together. It's a huge challenge we have to face. That is what is summed up in a few words with the title, The Necessary Reconstitution of the Historical Dialectic. Because what happened in the descending phase of the capital system's development, this historical dialectic has been undermined, and undermined in such a dangerous ways that it is now threatening the total destruction of humanity. This is what I bring to you with the hope and invitation that we can join together in the task of reversing this process and reconstituting, helping to reconstitute the historical dialectic. Now I have to apologize. I have to read my paper. Unfortunately, I cannot speak Portuguese. I read it, but I cannot speak. So forgive me, and please come along with me in this enterprise. As we know, the modern state was not formed as a result of some direct economic determination, as a mechanical superstructural outgrowth, in conformity to a reductivist view of the supposedly one-sided material domination of society, as presented in the vulgar Marxist conception of these matters. Rather, it was dialectically constituted through its necessary reciprocal interaction with capital's highly complex material ground. In this sense, the state was not only shaped by the economic foundations of society, but it was also most actively shaping the multifaceted reality of capital's reproductive manifestations throughout their historical transformations, both in the ascending and in the descending phase of development of the capital system. In this complex dialectical process of reciprocal interchange, the historical and the transhistorical determinations have been closely intertwined, even if in the course of the capital system's descending phase of development, we had to witness a growing violation of the historical dialectic, especially under the impact of the deepening structural crisis. For the defense of the established mode of societal reproduction at all costs, at any cost, no matter how wasteful and destructive its impact by now, even on nature, can only underline the historical anachronism and the corresponding untenability of a once all-powerful mode of productive societal reproduction, which tries to extend its power in a globalized form at a time when the absolute systemic limits of capital are being activated on a global scale. Moreover, the fact that the historical phase of modern imperialism, which used to prevail prior to and during the Second World War, is now replaced by the global hegemonic imperialism of the United States of America, attempting to impose itself everywhere as the global state of the capital system in general, does not solve any of the underlying contradictions at all. On the contrary, it can only highlight the gravity of the dangers inseparable from the structural crisis of capital's mode of controlling societal reproduction. For the imposition of global hegemonic imperialism of our time by the now dominant military power is no less untenable in the longer run than the traditional imperialist state rivalry which produced two devastating world wars in the 20th century. Far from successfully constituting the state of the capital system in general as a vain attempt to remedy capital's great historical failure on that score, the global hegemonic imperialism of the United States of America, with its growing military domination of the planet as an aggressive nation-state, the present phase of imperialism is the potentially deadliest of all. In the course of the capital system's historical unfolding, the legal and political superstructure assumed an ever more preponderant form. The present phase of global hegemonic imperialism is the most extreme manifestation of that, marking at the same time the end of a, for the time being, practicable, but in the longer run absolutely untenable road, given the still prevailing relation of forces in which some countries with massive population and matching military potential including China, are marginalized. For nothing could be more preponderant in terms of its domination of all aspects of social life, from the elementary conditions of material reproduction and their grave impact on nature, all the way to the most mediated forms of intellectual production, than the operation of a state system which directly and indirectly threatens the whole of humanity with the fate of self-destruction. Even a return to the formerly experienced violent state confrontations is feasible in the not too distant future, which would certainly terminate human life on this planet if the destructive antagonisms of the capital system are not resolved in a historically sustainable way within the time still at our disposal. Accordingly, only a qualitative transformation of the established legal and political superstructure in its entirety, together with the radical restructuring of its no longer viable material ground, can show a way out of this blind alley. This means an all-embracing transformation, which is conceivable only in the spirit of the envisaged socialist hegemonic alternative to capital's mode of social metabolic control. Excuse me, I had to skip some parts of it because it would be far too long to impose it on you. But it will have a continuity. Now we can go on. We can see the profound impact of the reciprocity between the material domain and the modern state by focusing attention on the inherent connection between the universal exchange relations unfolding under the rule of capital's generalized commodity production and the formal determinations that enable the systemically necessary equalization of incommensurabilities in the capital system. For this relationship, based on the universal predominance of abstract labor in the given social metabolic order, must be sustained at all levels of societal interchanges, formally obfuscating and fetishistically obliterating substantive incommensurability everywhere. Naturally, this includes the way in which the individuals involved in production and exchange are managed in capital's structurally preordained, and in that sense, as a matter of unalterable systemic determination, both hierarchical, iniquitous, and incurably antagonistic, but in another sense, formally equitable social reproductive order. As we know, generalized commodity production and exchange are unthinkable without universal value equation that must be constantly accomplished on the ground of capital's material reproductive practices. The formal reductive homogenization of all substantive relations, and thereby the reconciliation of irrational forms put into relief by Marx, is seminally important in this respect. It is crucial for understanding the profound interconnection between the material reproductive processes and the historically specific constitution of capital's ever more powerful legal and political superstructure required for the sustainable operation of the system as a whole. For, viewed simply from the angle of the particular units, the ever more complex exchange relations of the expanding material reproductive microcosms arising from the unrestrainable centralization and concentration of self-expansionary capital generate constantly greater demands for systemic cohesion and support, which they themselves, as locally confined productive structures, are totally incapable of satisfying. And the causal implication of that circumstance for the development of the legal and political framework itself would seem to be quite wrongly a one-way determination of the overall societal complex by the material basis. However, precisely because the just mentioned growing demands of the expansion-oriented productive units could not be satisfied at all by the particular material reproductive microcosms themselves, the historically arising complex exchange relations, which we are all familiar with, could not be established in the first place without bringing fully into play capital's legal and political framework as the necessary condition of systemic cohesion and development. Without the direct and indirect supportive involvement of the capital system's political dimension, even the most genuine expansionary needs of the reproductive microcosms would have to remain no more than frustrated abstract requirements instead of being turned into effective demands. This, again, strongly underlines the reciprocal determination of the historical dialectic in the real articulation of both the material reproductive basis of capital as a coherent system and its state formation. In this sense, the unfolding of the state's formal legal universality and capital's universal commodification are inseparable. The insuperable substantive structural hierarchy of capital's material basis finds its equivalent at the level of the legal and political relations, calling for the defense of the most iniquitous established order at all costs. Formal measures and rationalizations, no matter how ingenious, cannot obliterate the substantive inequalities and structural antagonisms. In fact, the need for apologetic ideological rationalization on that score becomes ever more pronounced parallel to the move from capital's ascending phase of development to the descending phase. Accordingly, Kant still needs no cynicism and hypocrisy when he contrasts the strictly formal equality of the law feasible under the rule of capital with the substantive inequality required for managing the given antagonistic social order. Thus, he writes without any camouflage that, and here I quote his words, the general equality of men as subjects in a state coexists quite readily with the greatest inequality in degrees of the possessions men have, whether the possessions consist of corporeal or spiritual superiority or in material possession besides. Hence, the general equality of men also coexists with great inequality of specific rights, of which there may be many. Nevertheless, all subjects are equal to each other before the law, which, as a pronouncement of the general will, can only be one. This law concerns the form and not the matter of the object regarding which I may possess a right. End of the quote. Very clear, very honest, without cynicism and camouflage by Kant. In the same way, Adam Smith is not in the least tempted by the need to hide that, here I quote his words, till there be property, there can be no government, the very end of which is to secure wealth and to defend the rich from the poor. Nothing could be clearer. However, by the time we reach capital's hired prize fighter, Hayek, Margaret Thatcher's companion of honor, that's an official title, Hayek, in the descending phase of the system's development, everything is turned upside down. The exploitative practices imposed on most of the Western proletariat and most of the millions of the developing world, defended by the neoliberal state, it all means at its disposal against the people who dare to oppose it, are glorified as moral postulates and are peremptorily told by Hayek, we are peremptorily told by Hayek, and here I quote his word, if we ask what men must owe to the moral practices of those who are called capitalists, the answer is their very lives. Now you know. The very lives. That's what we owe to capitalists. Everything is completely upside down. The particular irony in this respect is that Hayek claims to write in the spirit of Adam Smith, while in fact diametrically contradicting him. Contradicting without shame the same intellectual giant Adam Smith of the ascending phase of the capital system's development, who did not hesitate to denounce in his own time the deplorable fact, imposed today no less than in the past through the pretended moral practices of Hayek's idealized capitalists on most of the millions of the developing world, who clothe the world in appalling working conditions in the transnational sweatshops by saying, and here I quote again, Adam Smith, the people who clothe the world are in rags themselves. They are still in rags themselves. Adam Smith perceived very clearly that the unjust property system of his time could only be sustained on an enduring basis if the government of the established order kept on defending the wealth of the rich against the poor. In this way, by viewing the world with honesty from capital's vantage point, he realized that the material ground of the system, which he firmly believed in, and its governing political state were inseparable from one another. What was impossible, of course, for Adam Smith to spell out from capital's vantage point was the radical implication of his own insight. Namely, that in order to overturn the perceived and denounced injustice about those who clothe the world but are in rags themselves, the material ground and the protective political state of the system, which stood together, must also fall together. The increasing preponderance of the legal and political superstructure across modern history is very far from being a development of corrigible contingency. On the contrary, it is due to the state's innermost character and objective constitution. For the modern nation-state is absolutely unrestrainable in capital's own terms of reference as a matter of insuperable structural determination. The complete failure of all attempts aimed at a socially significant reform of the state in the course of the last century and a half speaks unmistakably on this score. To make matters worse, the structurally entrenched material basis of the capital system is also unrestrainable, as well as, in a socially significant sense, unreformable. Again, not as a matter of corrigible historical contingency, but as a result of its fundamental structural determination. In fact, the material, reproductive, and the legal political dimensions of the system have a most paradoxical relationship, for they powerfully contribute throughout their reciprocal historical interchanges to the immense expansion of one another, and thereby of themselves as well, but they are totally incapable of exercising a meaningful restraining impact on each other, not to mention on themselves. The inner logic of this type of development is that, as a result, we are subjected to the ultimately all-round destructive consequences of a dangerous one-way directionality, leading toward a potentially suicidal blind alley. This is so because a system of societal husbandry, which by its innermost constitution, a structural determination, is incapable of recognizing and acknowledging any limit, not even when doing so would be, as today, absolutely imperative, can offer no viable solution for the future. The perverse logic of the capital system is that the material and the legal political dimension can complement one another only in an ultimately unsustainable way. For although the legal political dimension can constrain centrifugality, centrifugality is the very nature of the material productive system. It can constrain centrifugality in the sense of the overall system and the overall systemic expansion. It is absolutely incapable of introducing rational restraint into its own mode of operation. This is so because it is incompatible with the concept of systemically overarching rationality required for meaningful restraint. That is the fundamental reason why the final articulation of the capitalist nation-state's inherent logic had to assume the form of imperialist rivalry, which persists today despite verbal denials no less than ever before. Hegel, a century prior to the unfolding of global wars, had no illusions whatsoever regarding the question of constrainability. He stated with striking openness, again honestly, with openness, the nation-state, here I quote him, the nation-state is mind in its substantive rationality and immediate actuality, and is therefore the absolute power on earth. End of quote. Ideas to the contrary, like the Kantian projection of perpetual peace and its proposed instrumentality of a League of Nations, proved to be no more than noble wishful thinking on capital's material ground. It has been proved after the attempted, established this League of Nations after the First World War, which was supposed to end all wars. That was its principal slogan. And what happened? The Second World War exploded in relatively little time. Wishful thinking, very noble wishful thinking, but we cannot leave matters at that. The untenable logic of capital's material reproductive microcosms is grow eternally or implode. The nowadays persistent wishful projection of all-round beneficial globalization is the ideological rationalization of that logic. At the same time, the oppressive imposition of the power of global hegemonic imperialism in our time, with its unhesitating engagement in massively destructive wars, including the wars pursued not so long ago in Vietnam and now in the Middle East, and indeed not shirking even from the threat of using nuclear weapons against state without such weapons, is the far from rational actuality, as Hegel calls it, corresponding to capital's unvarnished logic. The grave contradiction at the roots of such developments is that in our historical period of materially, productively, ever more intertwined global developments, we are being offered globalizing rationalizations within the horizon of the dominant aggressive nation state, the United States of America, and its military-industrial complex, but no viable solutions to capital's antagonisms, either in terms of the capital system's material ground or at the level of its rival state formations. The painful truth of the matter is that in view of the necessary historic failure of capital to constitute the state of the capital system as such, the capital system state in general, no sustainable solution is conceivable within the rationally in no way constrainable framework of capital's social order. Moreover, the historic failure to create the state of the capital system as such is itself by no means an incorrigible contingency, for the globally required legal and political framework of regulatory interaction, even if envisaged as confined to a relatively short period of transition on the road toward the positively working normativity, would need comprehensive rationality from the time of its inception in order to become historically sustainable. The capital system, however, is incompatible with anything other than the most restrictive and partial form of rationality. This is why the untenable logic of the capitalist nation-state in our time, asserting itself as before in the form of imperialist rivalry, irrespective of how its leading actors might change from time to time, remains with us even under the present-day conditions of potentially catastrophic collisions. Thus, the required radical transformation of the legal and political superstructure is inseparable from the reconstitution of the historical dialectic, which had been dangerously distorted and ultimately subverted in the course of capital's descending phase of development, degrading thereby the once positive self-expansionary drive of the system to the condition of blind uncontrollability. The key difference in relation to this problem is that the capital system was established in the first place on the ground of structurally safeguarded substantive inequality, thanks also to the unmitigated large-scale violence of the so-called primitive accumulation, which was greatly facilitated in its classic form in England by the absolutist state of Henry VIII. In complete contrast to capital's deeply entrenched substantive inequality in all domains, from the direct material to the most mediated cultural relations, the necessary alternative socialist mode of social metabolic reproduction cannot be considered historically viable unless it is qualitatively reconstituted and firmly maintained in its new social setting on the basis of substantive equality. Formal equality is useless in this respect. Stressing this vital contrast between the substantive defining characteristics of the historical alternative modes of social metabolic reproduction of our time is all the more important for us because in its ideologically well-diffused self-images, capital always proclaimed its programmatic adhesion, as far as its legislative terms were concerned, to contractual equality, just as in practical material reproductive terms it claimed to regulate the socio-economic order on the basis of universal value equation. However, all such practices have been actually pursued on the basis of this reductive transformation of substantive incommensurabilities into formally equalizable relations only, under the ubiquitous dominance of generalized commodity production and its fetishistically equalizable abstract labor. The profoundly iniquitous and structurally safeguarded substantive relations of exploitative domination and subordination could be therefore carried on undisturbed in capital societal reproductive practices for a very long time, until the onset of some major crisis as late as the monopolist imperialist phase of the system's development. In the meantime, the long persistent normality of universal value equation under the dominance of fetishistically generalized commodity production succeeded in conferring even the halo of liberty, fraternity, equality on the ideological conceptualizations of the capital system. The increasingly more preponderant legal and political superstructure of capital, unfolding in the course of history, with its inexorably expanding legal jungle that reached its climax in our own time, made a vital contribution to the continued success of this mode of societal reproduction. It fulfilled its problematical stabilizing role in a most authoritarian way in the descending phase of the capital's systemic development. Accordingly, it contributed by every possible means at its disposal to the ever more dangerous subversion of the historical dialectic. Prior to the articulation of the modern capital system and its state formation, the question of equality did not arise at all in relation to the socio-economic and political dimension of societal reproduction. As we know, Greek democracy could sustain its remarkably advanced political decision-making practices on the ground of slavery as its long-enduring material reproductive basis, a form of slavery regulated as a mode of social metabolic reproduction in which human beings could be characterized by a thinker as great as Aristotle himself as nothing more than talking tools. Moreover, even at a much later stage of historical development, the feudal state, in its well-known self-legitimatory efforts, did not hesitate to claim divine lineage on behalf of its privileged ruling personnel. This way of conceptualizing the world the world order represented no problem whatsoever, either for ancient slavery or for the feudal system of the Middle Ages. For in both cases, any concern with equality, not only substantive equality, but even formal, was totally irrelevant to the way in which the conditions of existence of the members of society were actually produced and reproduced on an ongoing basis. In complete contrast, the capitalist state's concern with equality right from the outset of its historical development was rooted in the formal equalizations of its material basis, formal equalizations, and as such, that kind of concern with equality was both necessary and genuine in its own terms of reference. The complicating fact was that the capital relation itself, based on the alienation of labor and its embodiment in capital, could be circularly presupposed in capital self-serving conceptualizations as the only feasible mode of the natural reproductive order at the level of the system's everyday operative principles. Accordingly, the contractual equality and universal value equation could be coherently proclaimed to constitute the effective modus operandi of the capital system by its greatest intellectual representatives, including Adam Smith and Hegel. This approach became untenable only when the question of the system's historical genesis had to be raised, precisely with a view to reassessing its viability as regards the future in the light of its structurally entrenched substantive inequality, which became contested by a growing class-based social movement in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. At that point, when the question of time appeared on the horizon, both with regard to the past and the future, the former circular presupposition of the operative principles themselves had to fail to fulfill its customary function. For in sharp contrast to formally stipulated equality, which can be ideologically rationalized under all kinds of totally untenable postulates, as we have seen it done even by a very great philosopher like Kant, as I quoted earlier, substantive equality with its qualitative determinations cannot be treated circularly so as to vindicate its a prioristic exclusion from commendable social normativity by arbitrarily proclaimed self-referentiality offered as a conclusive judgment by definition. And they offered it always in this form, by definition. Inevitably, therefore, once the question of substantive equality as such is raised in relation to the modern state, it brings with it the challenge to confront the difficult problem of the necessary withering away of the state in its historically constituted actuality. For within the historically determined confines of the modern state, which must be hierarchically ordered both internally and in its interstate relations, embodying thereby the radical alienation of the power of comprehensive decision-making from the social individuals, the very idea of substantive equality is of necessity structurally negated. However, the institution of a substantively equitable social reproductive order represents a fundamental challenge for our future, calling for the radical transformation of the hierarchically structured legal and political superstructure itself, together with its practical premises and material presuppositions. The great expansion of the capital system was made possible in the first place by the progressive advancement of a system of unchallengeable domination of use value by exchange value, through which universal equation, value equation, became the expansion securing dynamic operative principle of societal reproduction under the rule of generalized commodity production. As a vitally important member of a dichotomous system, exchange could exercise a dominant role in the material reproduction process, quite irrespective of the negative consequences arising in the longer run from its supremacy over production and over the demands it could impose behind the backs of the producing individuals, even on the available, necessarily finite natural resources. In the last analysis, therefore, a system of this kind had to run out of control once the objective systemic limits of capital's mode of social metabolic reproduction had been activated. In our time, moreover, what made matters worse was the fact that the alienating domination of human use by the fetishistic requirements of commodity exchange was not sustained simply by the given exchange relation in and by itself. The dominance of exchange over use had its equally problematical corollaries, which all together constituted an ultimately unmanageable system, a system of undialectical dichotomies which asserted themselves with categorical peremptoriness both materially and in the political domain. Indeed, the same kind of undialectical dichotomies, characteristic of the capital system as a whole, had to prevail through the domination of quantity over quality, of the abstract over the concrete, and of the formal over the substantive, as what we have seen in the necessarily reifying dominance of exchange value over use value under the established reproductive order's universal value equation. To be sure, at the roots of all of these inevitably distorting relations of one-sided domination and subordination, we find the politically secured and safeguarded structural subordination of labor to capital, rationalized through the most absurd but fetishistically for a long historical period well-functioning reproductive practice of formal reductive homogenization, which turns into a commodity and reductively equates living human beings with abstract labor. Think of that when you think of that, as that is an absolute outrage, this reductive equalization of living human beings with abstract labor. It is by no means surprising, therefore, that the ever more preponderant legal and political superstructure of the system played and continues to play an increasingly irrationalistic supportive role in delaying the moment of truth. That moment nevertheless arrives when it becomes unavoidable to pay for the destructive consequences of the unfolding dangerous developments on a global scale, both in the material productive domain and on the political military plane. As things stand today, given its preponderant power, the democratic state, so-called, can fulfill its irrational supportive role by brushing aside with cynically state-managed authoritarianism, whether it is neoliberal or neoconservative, any concern even about the regularly erupting major military collisions. In this sense, the radical transformation of the legal and political superstructure as a literally vital exigency of our time requires a fundamental change on a long-term sustainable material basis. That means overcoming the undialectical dichotomous domination of one side of the relations mentioned a moment ago over the other, from the ultimately self-defeating domination of exchange over use, as well as the abstract over the concrete, all the way to the historically no longer tenable obliteration of the vital qualitative determinations of any longer-term viable mode of societal reproduction, but a fetishism of universal quantification and the ensuing equalization of incommensurabilities. The reconstitution of the historical dialectic on a structurally secured, substantive, equitable basis is therefore not a speculative philosophical postulate, but a key objective exigency of our present-day conditions of existence. For the dangerous subversion of the historical dialectic coincided with the increasingly antagonistic descending phase of the capital system's development and the activation of its structural crisis, bringing with it the defiance of and the irrationalistic practical disregard for even the most elementary conditions of sustainable human life on this planet. Naturally, the legal and political superstructure of even the most authoritarian state, no matter how bloated and protected it might be, not only by its catastrophically wasteful military arsenal, but also by its ever denser legal jungle. The legal jungle is what we have in contemporary state, can in no way permanently counter the pressing character of these objective determinations and exigencies. Capital's mode of social metabolic control could prevail over a long historical period because it constituted an organic system in which the material basis of societal reproduction and its comprehensive legal, political, regulatory dimension were inextricably intertwined in a dynamic, expansionary way, tending toward an all-embracing global integration. Indeed, for almost 3 centuries, the capital system's expansionary drive could proceed quite unhindered. However, one of the insuperable structural limits of this system, burdened with the ultimately self-destructive logic of its unrestrainable nation-state formation, the necessity of monopolistic developments and the associated imperialist rivalry among the dominant state had to make the system itself historically unviable in an age when the pursuit of global war could only result in humanity's total self-destruction. And the other insuperable structural limit of the capital system is no less grave, for on the plane of material reproduction, its rationally unrestrainable self-expansionary drive, heavily promoted by capital state formation, inevitably reached the point of collision with the objective limits of our planetary resources, calling for the adoption of the qualitatively different societal reproductive practices of the only viable, in a humanly meaningful way, economizing economy in our planetary household. Naturally, with regard to the imperative to face up to the challenges arising from these fundamental structural limitations of the capital system, the radical transformation of its legal and political superstructure, together with its material basis in the spirit indicated in this lecture, is an absolutely vital requirement. Muito obrigado.
Bom, gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos. Em breve nós vamos organizar aqui dentro, que seria então o processo de distribuição de autógrafos. Lembrá-los que segunda-feira vai acontecer no Tuca, às 7 horas, uma continuidade do lançamento. Haverá um debate com Gordon Terborn, com Chico de Oliveira e também com o professor Mészáros. E aos que não puderem ficar mais, bom retorno às suas casas. É isso.